My presentation today is actually based on my dissertation, one of my dissertation chapters, and it's more like a snippet of a work in progress. So I'll just start by telling you how the fieldwork began. So in the summer of 2019, I conducted participant observation at 3 large-scale commercial sweet cherry plantations in Manisa, Çanakkale, and Eskişehir provinces of Turkey. I worked with the workers during the harvest, and I stayed at the villages where the plantations were located for a total of 3 months that year. Since 2019, I went back to Manisa plantation every year during harvest season, except for the year of the pandemic, 2020. The cherry plantations I visited were owned and managed by a globally competitive agribusiness, which is both a dominant producer and an exporter of fresh cherries in the region. The plantations I worked at were large-scale production sites up to 250 acres in size, basically the largest in Turkey, hosting 250 to 400 seasonal workers during the harvest season. This is kind of where the plantation that I kept going back to was. So I'll give you a bit of a context. Research on transnational agri-food order shows that since the 1990s, classical export commodities, which were coffee, tea, sugar, tobacco, etc., have been replaced by the so-called high-value foods, such as perishable fresh fruits and vegetables, poultry, dairy products, and whatnot. As new refrigeration technologies became available and new consumption trends took hold, especially in the high-income segments of advanced capitalist countries, diets composed of less red meat and more fresh fruits and vegetables came to be understood as healthier. Specifically, fresh fruits and vegetables came to be seen as an essential part of a balanced and nutritious diet. More recently, scholars have drawn our attention to the rise of high-value crop booms in the global south and their impact on local socio-ecological dynamics. High-value crop booms around the world have proliferated since the early 2000s due to the increasing size and volatility of international capital flows, as well as reduced regularity barriers for agri-trade and foreign investment in land. In addition to these factors, the rise of what Böckler and Berndt call ambiguous border regimes also have created precarious labor market segments who are easy to discipline, employed at lower costs, and very flexible, particularly the export and hence quality-oriented Mediterranean agri-food system. As a result, globally organized sourcing strategies that allowed powerful retailers to supply seasonal fresh produce year-round have not only bred cheap, flexible, and casual labor in spaces of food production, they have also deepened conditions of informality under which hyper-precarious labor regimes have flourished. In this context, my work describes the emergent relations of labor within Western Turkey's cherry-growing communities located in a region where export-oriented high-value agriculture have become prevalent since the early 2000s. Within these relations, I position labor contractors as fundamental agents who assemble workers on the ground during the 2-week harvest season, while at the same time attempting to produce the ideal worker on the job at the cherry plantation. And I view contractors as fundamental agents in Western Turkey's cherry production because the competitiveness of the agricultural production scheme I just described is really premised on the use of seasonal farm workers assembled by contractors. Here I'm talking about large numbers, like 300 to 400 workers a day during harvest, and the window in which sweet cherries can be picked for sale is extremely narrow. Cherries need to be harvested when they're almost or fully mature because they do not continue to ripen off the tree. Therefore, once picked, they don't store for very long, even if refrigerated. So time is of the essence for the producer, and they need harvest labor in large quantities real fast. This urgent need for quick and delicate action intensifies labor control and discipline tactics. Therefore, I argue that contractors who supply workers to producers for a fee do not merely mediate between labor and capital, but they effectively recalibrate the gender and race contract in spaces of informal agricultural work. In the context of export-oriented cherry plantations, labor contractors' main role is to mobilize gendered and racialized subjectivities to shape minority women and migrant workers into ideal cherry pickers who are nimble, dexterous, and docile. To achieve this, labor contractors strategically draw on two specific populist discourses that have recently gained traction in Turkey. These polarizing discourses are premised on two main ideas. The first is policing gender norms and enforcing conservative family values. And the second, pitting an authentically national us against an anti-national them. The cherry plantation serves as a platform where these populist ideas and practices become part of the norm and everyday fabric of the work environment. In fact, at the plantation, depolarization among a racially fragmented labor force feels like a ticking bomb. Tension can climb among worker groups if racial differences are not managed socially and spatially. In such a tense environment, control, discipline, and intimidation become a massive challenge for the plantation management. Therefore, as key actors who supply and manage harvest labor, contractors are positioned to realize capital's dream of productive compliance to this environment. Contractors are much needed to ensure that the gendered, racialized, and at times religious tensions among cherry pickers do not get in the way of the production of a docile, nimble, cheap, and flexible labor force. After all, such labor force is necessary for productivity and low production costs required to profit from cherry export. To achieve this, I found that labor contractors employ a set of strategies. For purposes of labor control, contractors recruit as many women as they can, and they keep mostly female worker families with Kurdish and Syrian backgrounds spatially apart from the local Turkish workers to avoid commotion and at times physical violence. There are examples of this, like physical violence, from the past years. Contractors also employ strategies to intimidate and discipline workers. This is done by strategic use of advance payments to create a condition of dependency through debt. In addition, they employ the populist nationalist ideology when they're among Kurdish and Syrian minorities and migrant workers to remind them their secondary position in society and intimidate them this way. Lastly, the discursive gender and racial hierarchies mobilized by contractors and the management are aimed to legitimize wage differences among men and women, and Turks and non-Turks. Coupled with the spatial segregation, this strategy also serves to keep migrant and minority workers in place. So the bottom line that I reached so far is that at the local scale, a highly fragmented, internationally weak labor force is key for the articulation of the region with the global cherry markets, and labor contracting emerges as a highly significant practice employed by producer-exporter agribusinesses for labor recruitment, control, and discipline by capitalizing on gendered and racialized social difference among workers. That's it for now. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Nil. And now we'll move on to Abby. So if you want to share your screen, you can go ahead.
Hi all. The title of my paper is Lived Experience of Paid Cashew Work and Unpaid Domestic Work, a study among women working in cashew processing in Kollam, Kerala. Before going to the details of the presentation, I would like to introduce myself because I believe that positionality of the researcher is one of the important aspects in the research itself. I am Babu. My pronouns are she or they, and this was my MA thesis, which I submitted to the Center for Women-Centered Practice at School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. And I come from Kollam region in Kerala, India. About my study, I would like to start by quoting Ghosh, 2013. All women are usually workers, whether or not they are recognized or defined as such. This paper is focusing on the interlinkages of paid cashew work and unpaid domestic work in the lives of women working in the cashew processing work. And it also talks about how women value and define their work. If you are looking at the cashew processing work, it is one of the labor-intensive industry which has a history of employing large number of women workers, which constitute more than 90%. And this cashew processing starts from procuring the raw cashew to making it into kernels or the cashew nuts. The study conducted by Mani in 2019 finds that major share of the cashew processing industry is clustered in the Kollam region in Kerala, where which the study was conducted. Literature review. Several literature talks about the interlinkages that exist between paid work and the unpaid work. Neither finds that the non-market, non-economic activity largely refers to the unpaid work that an individual undertakes, which is essential for household survival. The realization that two sets of activities are not independent, but are in fact interlinked with each other, has not been an easy one and has largely seen the result of several years of struggle by feminist economists and researchers. Another study, which was conducted by Ferran Pesanta and Nawaka in 2014, shows that there is a negative correlation between the time spent in unpaid care work and the labor force participation of women. It is from this context I was looking at the cashew processing work in Kerala. Kerala is considered as one of the states which has no restrictions in terms of women's education or employment. But a study conducted by Kodoth and Epens states that the disaggregate data analysis of the state level gender development indicates the low participation of women in the employment. Lindbergh is one of the researchers that who conducted extensive study in cashew, which has lens which focused on caste, gender, class, and so on. They find that cashew industry grew to a large group of registered factory workers in the region itself, and which has employed 95% of women. The study conducted by V.V. Giri National Labour Institute in 2014 indicates major characteristics of the cashew industry. It employs workers from socially and economically disadvantaged sections in terms of caste, class, and gender. And there is low presence of younger workforce. 81% are in the private cashew processing units. And in the cashew processing unit, there are different sections of work in which shelling and cutting are considered as unclean work, quote unquote. These were mainly employed by SC category workers. SC means scheduled caste, which are the marginalized caste within India. And they earn very less rate of wage and also majorly piece rate basis. There is also high level of indebtedness among the workers. We can also see a large network of home-based work within this cashew processing unit, and which is one of the invisibilized section of work within this cashew processing industry. The study conducted by Lindbergh finds that the large share of women workers deconstruct the conventional image of men as breadwinners. And there is extensive gender division of labor in which most of the work from shelling, cutting, packing, grading, and all these are conducted by women. And there are loading work or roasting work, which are considered as more manual, quote unquote, are done by men. And there is also a caste organization of the work in which the people from the oppressed caste community are mainly engaged in the socially considered unclean processing of work. Now we can look into the research methodology. This study used qualitative research method to understand the meanings, subjective experiences and perceptions of women. Through a feminist approach, this focus on the voices, perceptions of the women workers. And the study was conducted in the Kollam district of Kerala, where the industry is largely clustered. And to select the sample, the study used purposive snowball sampling, and it also conducted interviews at government factory and the house of private factory workers. And from these factory workers, the data on home-based work was collected through a retrospective data collection. Non-participant observation methods also used. These are the research objectives and research questions. Now we can look at the analysis of what is emerging from the study, from the experience of women. We can see that the location of cashew work, where the cashew work is located, whether it is in the factory, whether it is in the house, it really determines how the women experience their work, both paid and unpaid work. And from the conversation of women, we can see that for women, factory work is feasible in terms of managing both paid cashew work and unpaid domestic work, because of mainly due to the regulated working hours. And there is also a continuum of factory-based work and home-based work in the lives of several women, because they take the cashew from the factory to their home for their family survival. In terms of experience of paid cashew work, we can see that where the women are located and in which form of work, it really determines the risk, security, condition of work, and relations. And we can see that factory work provides visibility to the women in terms of regulated working hours, regulated wage, worker identity, wage security, opportunities for interaction, and so on, as compared to the home-based work. And there is an extensive intergenerational transfer of cashew work. We can see that women have their mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers who are working in the same section of work itself. This also clearly indicates a caste-based organization of cashew work, because in caste, there is a hereditary transfer of work. Also, the identity of the worker determines where they are located in the work. When we are looking at the experience of unpaid work, we can see that there is a normalization of the aspect of domestic work they are doing at their families. Especially, in the conversation, we can see that there is a perception of duty or responsibility coming from their conversations. But it doesn't mean that they value paid work than their unpaid work. We can see that they prioritize both, because they need that in terms of their survival and their family survival. One of the major findings of the study is the spectrum or the continuum of paid cashew work and unpaid domestic work. We can see that there rather than a duality, these experiences exist in a spectrum. Their feelings, thoughts, experience, relations, and embodiments of work, it shapes and reshapes both, and it also constructs the continuum. And they prioritize both and they value both, but we can see that they define, or when we are looking at the conversation, there is a difference, because paid work has a more regulated kind of experience, or in terms of financial, but that is absent in terms of their unpaid work. Then what connects both paid and paid cashew work and their domestic work is the women itself. The women are the one who creates the spectrum, and they're bound in a cycle of work, not only physically, but also emotionally and mentally. How women value and define their work. Throughout this conversation, we can see that they doesn't value one over the other or prioritize one over the other. Both are important and integral to their life. And different words and perceptions and experience are coming from both these both these aspects of the spectrum. Now, I would like to conclude the whole paper by saying that work is an integral element of the lived realities of women, which determines and shapes their day-to-day activities, relations, interactions, and ultimately their survival itself. But due to the conventional conceptualizations or practices, unpaid activities are highly undervalued and invisibilized. There is caste and class organization of work, and it determines where the workers are located. What is core to the continuum of unpaid work and paid cashew work is the survival of life. And it is the women who interlink and construct the continuum through their embodiments of work. These are my references, and thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Abby. And now we can move on to Chris.
So I'm going to be talking today about the research I'm working on for my dissertation. And it looks at the relationship between agrarian transformation or agrarian change and labor migration between Ontario and Guatemala. So Guatemalan migrant farm workers working in Ontario. And I'm not going to look at all of my research questions here, but specifically today, I'm going to be presenting some of the kind of preliminary findings from speaking with workers about their experiences. And I'm looking at the question of what can the experiences of these workers, Guatemalan workers in Ontario, tell us about the connections between patterns of agrarian change on a hemispheric scale, and how does their migration impact agrarian social relations in both Ontario and Guatemala? And so I'm going to be focusing on the elements of the data I've been collecting that are contributing towards my eventual kind of answer to those questions. So the status of the project, just to give a brief overview. So it's a work in progress. I'm currently conducting fieldwork in Southwest Ontario. I've been conducting interviews with Guatemalan migrant farm workers. I've got 11 participants so far. I'm aiming for at least 20. And I've been doing semi-structured interviews, usually around an hour to an hour and a half at the most in duration, alongside follow-up conversations when I've kind of reviewed the recordings and transcripts. Then I'm going to be doing corresponding fieldwork in Guatemala starting in January next year, looking hopefully to do interview work with community members in the home communities of origin of some of the workers I've spoken to here, as well as seeing if I can speak to others who've worked in Canada who are now back in Guatemala. I've been primarily based with my fieldwork in Ontario in the Leamington area. I have some leads for speaking to workers outside of that area, but all of the workers that whose responses are being reflected on today are in the Leamington area in Southwest Ontario. So just to briefly run through, I'm going to try and not get too bogged down in this, the theoretical framework. So this kind of, one of the kind of launching off points for this is the kind of status of what's called the agrarian question today. And the classical agrarian question from particularly Marxist political economy looks at the extent to which capitalist social relations have penetrated and transformed agriculture and associated way of life in the countryside, and looking to what extent pre-capitalist formations in rural areas kind of persist. And this looks at the extent of capital penetration in the countryside and the way in which it's accumulated. However, in 2023, in the 21st century, particularly when thinking about Ontario, the kind of classical approach to the agrarian question is not really sufficient. And so I take inspiration from Henry Bernstein's work, who kind of argues that there's not really an agrarian question of capital today in the vast majority of the world, and that it's really now one of an agrarian question of labor rather than capital, and what's happening to the working class or working classes, because he puts quite a focus on kind of differentiation between between rural populations and workers in rural areas as being kind of the fundamental thing that we need to be thinking about when looking to address agrarian issues today. And so just this quote at the end here from Bernstein, our task here really is to determine and analyze the relationship between different agrarian structures and dynamics, rural and urban structures of class inequality, labor markets, patterns of employment and reproduction in local, national and global circuits of economic activity and their interconnections. And so it's this last bit that I'm very much focused on here in terms of understanding the position of workers in a global economy, but also their kind of very local experiences. I also root my analysis in uneven development, which feels to me kind of intimately linked in with the agrarian question, drawing particularly on the work of Fuad Maki here and kind of thinking about uneven development as a relational global process that is to be understood in kind of a grand structural sense, but also we really need to look at its concrete conditions of existence, in particular social formations, as Maki puts it. And then I'm also kind of the particular method of analysis that I'm using to think through the responses I get and kind of frame the diverse responses from the research participants that I've been speaking to is the labor regimes, and particularly kind of more recent Marxist political economy work on labor regimes from Taylor and Ryu, and also the collection that was released a couple of years ago by Baglioni, Campling, and other authors, editors. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that before I go to look at some interview responses here. So this quote from Taylor and Ryu, I find kind of it's a very simple quote in some senses, but it has kind of a lot of weight to it in terms of the way of understanding the world, the way of understanding worker experiences that I'm looking to employ here. So it's a workforce does not emerge out of thin air. Rather, it must be produced and reproduced through a range of social institutions and processes that shape the availability of workers, their relative costs, and more specifically, their conduct and expectations about work. So this is kind of drawing our attention to thinking about how is a workforce both produced and reproduced? What are the characteristics of this workforce, and how and by what are these characteristics shaped? And so by asking this question, Taylor and Ryu argue that this opens up what they describe as an essential window onto the social foundations of the global economy. So by paying attention to kind of very specific workplace dynamics, the very specific experiences of workers, not just in the workplace, but how they arrive at the workplace and how they and everything that goes into that can tell us a huge amount about the global economy. And my contention is that in the particular labor regime that I'm going to go on to talk about in a second, this has an awful lot of interest to it because these workers work between different, well, their workplace is in a different place to the place in which they're produced and reproduced as workers. And so labor regimes approaches situate workplaces within kind of wider processes of global capitalist transformation and change. And I think this also kind of allows us then to reflect on the way in which workplaces will have a bearing on whatever form the contemporary agrarian question takes as well. So I just to briefly kind of establish a bit of the context about Guatemalan migrant farm workers in Ontario. So these workers come to Ontario under the agricultural stream of Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program. And the participation of Guatemalan workers in this has almost tripled since 2016. This is in Canada as a whole. So there's almost 19,000 workers with the provisional figures came under this scheme in 2022. In Ontario, the numbers are smaller. The majority of workers from Guatemala are in Quebec, but there's a growing number of workers in Ontario from Guatemala. And this figure has roughly had a corresponding rise as well. And this is a significant rise in really just six or so years. And just the kind of other corresponding side of this importance of this changes that remittances as a percentage of Guatemala's GDP continue to rise. And in 2021, the last available data was that it was the highest ever. Obviously, an enormous proportion of this is from the US, but we can see that there's an increasing importance of migrant remittances from Ontario, from Canada as well, for a certain subset of Guatemalans. And so I'm looking to define participation in the agricultural stream of the temporary foreign worker program as a particular labor regime. So this draws our attention to the nature of the program, its temporariness, its reliance on particular nationalities and particular manners, which means that we can look at each nationality's participation as a particular regime within the overarching labor regime. So this is what I'm calling a nested labor regime analysis, where there might be kind of several different regimes. So the initial findings, and I'm going to try and speed up a bit so I can look at this in more detail. The initial findings here kind of draw our attention to these matters: the way in which workers are produced, the relationship between rural social relations in Guatemala, rural social relations in Ontario, obviously dramatically different, but also migrant workers act as a kind of mediation to allow us to think about the links between these sets of rural social relations. And this also includes social reproduction, broadly defined, so raising and caring for children, education, healthcare, land access, agriculture itself. All of these factors kind of come up quite a lot in the interviews. So what are the characteristics of this particular labor regime that are emerging for me here? So one is agricultural experience. So workers have a particular skill set and background. They typically have a great deal of experience in farming of a particular type. So this is one worker from Isabel in the east of Guatemala near the Caribbean coast. And he talks about how he's not a professional, but he's learned something from his parents. He's become a worker and a fighter. And so that's kind of the grounding for his opportunity to come here. And this is a worker from Tecpan in the highlands. So it's quite kind of almost on the other side of the country. He talks about the first thing that the agencies ask you is your experience in agriculture. They ask you what you've been doing in Guatemala, what experience you have in agriculture as part of working out if they want to admit you into the program. This is a worker from Zacatepeques, which is kind of nearer to Tecpan, kind of the same sort of highland region. And then he talks here about kind of the depth of experience, not just for him, but his family in agriculture, and that his entire world, his entire kind of family life has been rooted in agricultural work, in agriculture as a way of life. And so he traces this as being something that has been at least 100 years within his family, and so he comes from that background. However, so it's obvious from this that agricultural experience is really important for the agencies that are looking to hire these workers on behalf of farmer employers in Ontario. However, workers have a really mixed opinion on the value of their actual experience to Canadian employers. So this is the same worker who has the kind of 100-year history of agriculture with his family, saying, he thinks in Canada the only thing that they need is the worker, or the mano in Spanish, literally hand. So they're not going to value your experience. It's of no use here. This guy has, technical agricultural qualifications. He's the most qualified worker I've spoken to. He has an enormous weight of experience, both practical and educational in agricultural matters. But here he says the employer response is essentially, who cares? What they want is a worker who will do what they say. And so beyond experience and knowledge, there's something more ephemeral that workers believe employers are seeking, and that's a particular type of worker. So the worker from Isabel described it as we bring, as you can say, a capacity of resistance to work. And another worker from Tecpan says, we have worked in agriculture, so we're not afraid of any work. We are determined to do the work as it is. So it's kind of maybe less about agricultural experience than a particular type of worker that's been produced by working in agriculture in Guatemala. And so I'm going to speed up a little because I realize I'm nearly out of time. Land relations in Guatemala as a context. So looking at this, we understand how workers are produced and reproduced. The workers kind of talk about the difficulty of conducting agriculture in Guatemala and cultivating and making a living from agriculture themselves. So talking about problems with soil, problems in being able to access sufficient water. The last quote here, a worker from Tecpan talks about how he would like to spend the money that he's earning from working here on being able to improve his agricultural situation in Guatemala and install an irrigation system. But this also kind of highlights the precarity at home related to agriculture and land access. So it's really difficult to be able to buy land to farm. There's often a lot of talk about the kind of crisis of land prices and enormous growth in land prices in Ontario, but there seems to be an equivalent process going on as workers understand it in Guatemala, where it's very difficult to access land as well. And so that's what these kind of quotes there. And then just to move on to the kind of corresponding side of this, there's also precarity in Ontario. So it's a vulnerable and compliant workforce that are being created related to the kind of production of the type of worker that I was talking about before. And so this worker here from TechPan identifies that they're also looking for kind of there's differences between nationalities. So this worker is claiming that because Jamaicans are more likely to unite and speak up in the workplace, in his opinion, that's maybe why they prefer Guatemalan workers, and that would be his account for this was specifically in response to my question, why do you think the number of Guatemalans in Ontario is growing so much? And this is how he framed it. And then this is the person from Zacatepec. He said that he thinks that that there's the kind of the Guatemalan worker is 100% farmer, and so that's kind of makes they prefer people like that because they have stamina. So this is the kind of double side of a vulnerable workforce, but also a workforce with a particular capacity. And then this is just a little bit of reflection on what is perceived as a lack of dignity, but I'm going to speed up because I need to finish. And then the last point of this would be that there's also a kind of specific work day here that's related to this. So you work more here, the work is significantly longer, and in some respects harder than Guatemalan work in Guatemala. I don't have time to go into it, but the use of machines here also makes it correspondingly less physically challenging in some worker opinions. And then also there's this kind of constant process of speeding up and demanding more, and that the employer is never satisfied. So to conclude, the emerging elements here, kind of these are the parts that I'm identifying as part of this particular labor regime, and my kind of preceding task is to identify how these elements kind of fit together and how this can be considered as a kind of particular labor regime, and what that can tell us about the relationship between land relations and agrarian change in Ontario and Guatemala. Thank you.